The day has finally come. We're ready to finally deploy the NSX T Manager in our lab so that we can actually start building everything out. I highly encourage you to follow along in your home lab if you can. This is where the real learning will occur. If you can't follow along though, I think the next best step would be to watch this video a couple of times, get comfortable with the steps, and also check out the VMware hands-on labs. That way you can kind of get some kind of stick time with NSXT and it will make a lot more sense and you can use that to follow along. That said, if you are deploying this in your home lab, you're going to want to download the NSXT Unified Appliance OVA. It's about 11.5 gigs, and I'm using version 3.0. A lot of you are probably wondering where you can download it from. One place I would recommend is using a vMug Advantage membership. This actually gives you licenses and the ability to download NSXT, as well as a bunch of other VMware products, and I think it's an annual subscription, so it's actually a really good deal when you think about it. That said, let's get to the actual deployment. So to deploy this OVA, we're just going to right-click on the host we plan on deploying it on top of, and we're going to go to Deploy OVF Template. I'm going to select Local File, and I'm going to select that Unified Appliance OVA. As I said, it's about 11.5 gigs, right on target. I'm going to hit Open, and Next. I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it NSXT, and I'm going to hit Next. I'm good with it being on this host, so I'm going to hit Next as well there. Alright, so at this screen, the only thing I want to point out is just that if you thin provision this, it's only going to take about 5 gigs of storage, but if you thick provision this appliance, it will be 300 gigs, so it's pretty heavy. So I would recommend for a lab environment to thin provision. I'm going to go ahead and hit Next. There's not really anything else important on that page. So at this page, we're going to pick the size of the deployment. How much memory and CPU and RAM and all of that are we going to take for this appliance? It's going to be very tempting to pick small or extra small, but here's the thing. Look at this warning here. This configuration is only supported for the NSX Cloud Service Manager role. This is a specific appliance that we would deploy in addition to the regular NSXT Manager, and this would be for integration with like native AWS or Azure. So we don't want that one. Now if we go up to small, we see here it now says this configuration is supported for Global Manager production deployment. Now we can do small or medium ultimately. I typically do small in my home lab and that is just fine. There is a resource reservation, so if you don't have a bunch of resources, you'll have to tweak it, and I'll show you where you can do that. But in a nutshell, I would say if you're in your lab, go with small. The only thing to know here is, again, we're going to select our data store. I've got a local data store here, and I'm going to make sure I change this to thin provision, or else I may not have enough storage available. So this network is going to be the management network for the appliance. So I'm going to use this one right here, and that should be good. And the IP address will actually be setting on this page right here. Alright, so at this page, this is going to prompt us for a bunch of usernames and passwords, and starting right here, we have some root usernames, we have a CLI admin account, we have an audit account, which is a read-only account, but I want to show you guys something really interesting from the manager documentation. So if you flip over here, this is just through the VMware documentation website, and if we go down here, let's see, it's down here somewhere, there we go, installation scenarios. So this is really key. This gives you a bunch of things to look out for when you're setting these passwords. The biggest issue is that the validation here, there is no validation for passwords. If I said, I'm just going to type password, it says there that it's not going to let me, but I can actually type a password that is slightly more complex, and it will pass enough to get through the OVA deployment, but the appliance itself will come up and it won't like that password. So it does tell you here some of the requirements and that sort of thing, but I like to refer back to the documentation. So just be aware, you'll see things here like if the password for admin does not meet the complexity requirements, you must log into the NSX Manager through SSH or at the console with the admin username and the password of default. So just keep this in mind. So if you run into issues with deployment, this is likely where you're hitting a wall. So that said, I know my password is plenty complex, so I'm going to go ahead and paste it in there, and we should be fine. So that first account, by the way, that's just the root admin account or the root account. That is basically, I call that the bad day account. So you run into a major issue, you'll need that, but otherwise you shouldn't really need it. This is going to be our main admin account, so we will be using that. I actually set them to the same for my lab. Obviously in production we wouldn't want to do that. And we're going to have this read-only account. This is just for, as it says, auditing purposes. Now, we do have the opportunity to change the admin and audit account username. So if we don't want to use if we want to use a non-standard username instead of, for example, admin, we could do that. In my case, I like to stick with the default, especially for the lab. However, you don't technically have to put anything here. As you see here, it shows default is audit, default is admin. I feel good just putting input there, so I always put it in there. You don't have to. We scroll down here, we don't have to put anything here. It says specifically for internal use only, so don't worry about that. Now we put it in a host name. I couldn't talk there for a second. I'm going to go with NSX T, and that does not have to be an FQDN, so I'm good there. I'm going to have a role name here. You can leave this to NSX Manager by default. Basically, this is for public cloud integration. This one would be for federation. So I'm doing multi-site, that sort of thing. But if I'm not doing multi-site or public cloud integration, stick with NSX Manager. Again, this site name is actually for federation use cases. You don't technically have to put something here, but I like to put something there, so I'm going to do New York, all one word. Now I'm going to start specifying my management IP details. So this is just going to be my default gateway for the management network. I'm good with that. And my management IP, I think I'll go with that. And a subnet mask. Now I'm going to specify my DNS, which I happen to have a DNS server in my environment. I highly recommend that you do this for more than one reason. vCenter itself kind of gets weird if you don't have DNS installed. So if you don't have a DNS server, always good to spin one up, especially with all the products you're deploying in your lab when you get to NSXT. I think I'm good with that. My domain search list is home.lab. That's just my home domain. Alright, so I'm going to put in my NTP server here. And I'm going to enable SSH and root login. These are highly insecure, but since it's my home lab, it's perfectly fine. Below that, we don't have to input any of this stuff. So it asks for manager IP, some thumbprints, stuff like that. We don't have to do any of that. So that's all the configuration we need. So everything should be good. So I'm going to hit next. And I know all of this should be fine. We reviewed this pretty well, so I'm going to hit finish. Now, just to monitor the status of the deployment, I'm going to open that up. And I will just fast forward the video quite a bit because this is going to take a while. Again, this is 11.5 gig OVA, so we're just going to be very, very patient with it. Once it finishes the deployment, we're going to have to power it on. And powering it on, honestly, takes about 10 to 15 minutes, at least when you use the small instance, for it to come fully online before we can actually hit the web interface and actually navigate to it. So the secret here is just be really patient with your deployment. So the deployment finished. Now let's go ahead and power up the manager. And as I mentioned, we're going to give this a little bit of time. So let's go ahead and watch the web console so we can just watch it spin up. And as I mentioned, you do have to be very patient. It will take a while. So as you see here, it already shows me the login prompt. I don't need to do anything from the CLI, but if I go navigate directly to it, and I'll actually do that right now that I think about it. And as you see here, it's just spinning. So let me see if I can even reach it. I should be able to. Yep. So I can ping it. Yeah, there you go. It finally canceled out. So as I mentioned, patience is a virtue when it comes to deploying NSXT from a manager standpoint. It just takes a little while to come online. So I'm going to pause the video, and once it's fully online, I will show you. If you do try this at home and you get any kind of error messages on this page, it's likely that you just need to give it a few more minutes. So just be patient. Alright, so the manager is successfully deployed. Now we're going to log in with our admin username and our credentials we configured as part of the initial OVA setup. I'm going to go ahead and hit login. Now I did cheat a little bit and I logged in right before I hit record on this video just to make sure everything was functioning properly. You will be prompted with an end user licensing agreement. Just make sure you scroll to the very bottom and check the box, and that will let you get to the screen you see here. Now the only thing left is to go into manage licenses, and you'll want to add your appropriate NSX license that you have to be able to kind of get to some of the more advanced functionality. Without the license, you can do all the navigation and you can do a lot of stuff, but you won't be able to fully deploy all of your logical routers and edges and load balancing and that kind of stuff without that license. You will see in there also that there is a vShield endpoint, I believe it's called, or NSX vShield, something to that effect. that license is actually for service insertion. That is not your regular NSX license. So just keep that in mind. You will need to add an additional license to be able to get through some of this functionality. So that said, I'll see you guys in the next video. We'll start going over kind of a tour of the NSX T Manager GUI, and I'll show you around all of these menus and that sort of thing, and it's going to be awesome. I'll see you guys there.